The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Gary from Vigilant Software. I hope that I'm coming through loud and clear. And we're going to start on the webinar for this morning or this afternoon's presentation regarding cyber risk. What is it? How can we help mitigate it? And what sort of tools are available to help you on existing projects or to help eradicate any sort of cyber threat to the organization you're currently working for. So as we go through today's presentation, we do have a chat field. It will be seldomly monitored as we go through, but at the end we do leave time for a Q&A session so we can cover off any sort of queries that you have. If you're able to timestamp roughly when the question is going to be raised, then it should help us to navigate exactly what part of the tool or part of the presentation that we were referring to at that given point. So just as a quick introduction to myself, some of you on the meeting have already had conversations with me. I am Gary. I'm one of the lead technical support agents for Cyber Comply. I work for a company called Vigilant Software, who is partnered with IT Governance, who have a wide range of tool sets as well as skill sets available to help with cyber risk, data protection, etc. So what we've tried to build out here is a platform that will help an organization essentially track and identify any sort of risk or threat, possible vulnerabilities to an organization to cut back on cyber attacks. With the recent political issues going on surrounding Brexit, whilst the rest of the country seems to be on a bit of a hold gap, cyber criminals and the like will not be taking this lightly. They'll be using these times as a prime time to actually start attacking larger organizations that may have their guard down whilst we're working our way through Brexit and other government-related issues. So with that in mind, what we want to try and help organizations with is to understand what sort of controls, what sort of frameworks a business might need to have in place to reduce this sort of issue, to help you understand and obviously portray this onto the rest of the organization that you can't take stopgaps on this. Cyber criminals, they're happening every 100,000 times a day, continuously trying to find a flaw in an organization's firewalls, gateways, anything they can try and get in to try and get hold of any form of data. Now, it might be data that they're after. It could be simply disruption of your business. By this, it could be simply shutting down servers to prevent availability of data. It may even cause, if we recall back to the recent British Airways incident where they simply diverted traffic from the BA's homepage to a cloned website, and there are obtaining around 185,000 British Airways customers' details, including payment data, names, addresses, etc. So not only was it causing a detriment on the actual workflow of the organisation, they're also putting their customers at risk as well. So what we are suggesting that you may put into place is 27001 and such like frameworks. NIST 800 is also a good one, all the way down to even Cyber Essentials to try and get the bare basics up and running to make sure you do have the correct firewalls in place, you have the correct permission access to users within the organization as well. So what we're going to walk you through is essentially our platform CyberComply that we've produced. Now, I know that some people on the call today are current users of vsRisk and other elements of CyberComply, and we might have some other users that are potentially new or looking to move into using the platform in their business as well. So as we go through, we are going to cover off today's discussion is going to be an introduction to what CyberComply is and how it's going to help you, who it potentially may be aimed at within the organization, bearing in mind this isn't limited to these people, it's just predominantly who we see using it. We're going to cover off some of the unique selling points to what CyberComply can do for you over things like spreadsheets, maybe just manual workflows. And then, as I mentioned at the very end, we're going to cover off a question and answer session to just alleviate any sort of concerns you might have, both regarding to CyberComply or just cyber risk in general. So what is CyberComply? CyberComply is a complete system suite which will help an organization track, identify, manage risk. We can have multiple users logged into the platform simultaneously, so projects aren't being put on hold by weighty spreadsheets which need to be shared around a number of different people, all trying to edit them at the same time in their own way. So we tried to build a system that's both uniform, systematic and collaborative all at the same time. So we have a few bullet points here. I'm not going to sit here and essentially read them out, but I've touched on a few of them. We've built the system to be scalable, so whether you're a single individual working as a consultant for a larger organization, we've built it for that purpose. We've also allowed it to be scalable up to medium-sized and small enterprise-sized businesses as well. So by giving the access to the multiple organization admins that you may need to have working on a project, we also have read-only access, as part of implementing some sort of framework is going to be a matter of getting essentially the people with the money on board, because implementing these sort of frameworks, they're not cheap. However, if you look at the recent fines and costings that have come of cyber attacks, it simply is a drop in the ocean. We've built the tool to be repeatable, so whilst we understand that spreadsheets are great for cut, paste, copy, paste. They can at times contain macros. They can at times contain formulas in place to work out certain metrics, which is fine. However, if you are manipulating spreadsheets, or if you've got somebody else working on it for you, they could mess up this type of formula, and therefore it could put out the entire risk assessment. We've built it to reduce variability by helping making consistent decisions. So by this I mean, as we go through the assessment, you're handheld through, okay, we've identified this area, what would be the natural step to work on next? So we've tried to make it as consistent, based on fact rather than human interpretation, again going back to the manual work. As I've already aforementioned, the collaborative and uniformed workflow. So this is again just that kind of everybody has to work in the same fashion to achieve the same goal. As we go through, it will also be maintainable, so the data will remain there. You can modify it, you can change information on there, it's entirely up to you. And we've tried to make it all in one place for governance, risk and compliance, making it a quick and cost-effective route to general safeguarding of the business. The individual offerings of CyberComply, whilst one we are predominantly focusing on is going to be vsRisk Cloud this morning, are the GDPR Manager, our Compliance Manager, which offers organizations the ability to view particular frameworks and regulations, Data Flow Mapping Tool, which helps organizations satisfy Article 30 of the General Data Protection Regulation. And a sweet spot for a bolt-on for there is the data protection and impact assessment to understand what risks might be in tow when you're deciding to work on new projects or new processes. So vsRisk is, as I mentioned, going to be the main focal point for today's presentation. What we've tried to do with vsRisk is essentially cover off what we've already mentioned. So try and bring in more of a uniformed manner of working on projects. It will allow you to work from multiple different control sets depending on if you're implementing 27001. We have quite a few US-based companies that also use in conjunction with NIST 853, and there's also other elements. If you're looking at payment protection, etc., we do have PCI controls in there and frameworks from Cyber Essentials as well. We will also be adding a document storage area, which will allow you to upload documents, policies, workflows, etc., to help support the risk assessment, risk treatment plans, the implementation of controls, as well as just general supporting documents for understanding or logging where your scope is going to be kept, and understanding the breadth of what the risk assessment is going to try and cover. We'll also be able to show you the risk treatment plan that is built into vsRisk. There's no need to run separate sheets or any other separate system by exporting. It can just be run simultaneously along with the assessment, and the same goes for the statement of applicability, including not just one set of controls, but all of the control sets you may be utilizing. We then have the compliance manager. This is ultimately where the home of the framework and the controls are going to be, as well as regulations. It will also show you the crossover between the UK law and DPA 2018 here in the United Kingdom, as well as the GDPR and how they coexist with one another, and more importantly, how it ties in with ISO 27001. Those are the controls that we've mentioned previously. So Cyber Essentials, ISO 27001, NIST PCI. We have the regulations I just mentioned, and the ability to upload your own organizational controls and regulations. A prime example of this might be is we've been working with a relatively large motor group, both here in the UK and in Europe. So whilst they are using a framework that's been put into place by ISO and the standard regulations for the European Union, they may also have their own internal controls and regulations as part of the group. So if there's franchisees, if there's locations outside of their home state, whether it's Germany, France, United Kingdom, Spain, etc., they'll be able to upload those documents and reference them in exactly the same manner that we give the ability to with our own set of controls. The data flow mapping tool will help an organization both map out their processes as well as identify where there may be pitfalls or where there may be flaws in their processes to what they might need to plug. And then that will take them nicely onto the data protection impact tool, which will essentially help them understand what those risks might be, if they're actually able to continue with the process and ultimately have it signed off by a official data protection officer. We then have our GDPR manager, which will give an organization the ability to record and report on data breaches. So this is obviously a requirement of the GDPR, but it is also a helpful point when we are looking at risk assessments. If you're able to understand what your data breaches are and who your third parties might be, it will give you a clear or a helping start to understand where your risks might lie in the business. If you've already identified them and you're now starting to see an increase in data breaches, it might be worth trying to plug that gap through the use of your assessment. Okay, who is cyber compliant and vsRisk for? Now, we do have a standardized list here. These will be either your own title that you've joined on today, or ones that you've heard of predominantly throughout businesses. So we have things ranging from information security officers and managers, risk managers, predominantly when we're looking at maybe individual parts of your risk assessment as opposed to the overall assessment or the implementation itself. Data protection officers when we're looking more towards GDPR. Lead implementer, so if you have been on a small plug here, the IT governance, risk assessment or risk management courses, as well as lead implementer, this might end up being a job title that you acquire from that. We then have security consultants. So as we've mentioned, vsRisk can be used by consultants themselves. It's not limited to an organization. And if you are acting as a consultant, it will allow you to log into all of your multiple clients and manage their assessments remotely, as opposed to always having to be on site. You also might be known as an ISMS coordinator, so ultimately you are head of the implementation of a particular framework, maybe the head of the information security management system, or simply just coordinating how the project is going to be put into place across the business. The last one is quite an unfortunate title, simply by the fact that 27001 risk assessments or any other type of risk assessment tends to fall onto the shoulders of the head of IT or an IT manager. Whilst, yes, they do have a great insight into the infrastructure of an organization, typically they may have been the ones who put it into place or are going to be managing it through documentation. The risk assessment is not simply limited to information security management systems in what some people perceive to simply be servers, laptops, things like that. People that are more familiar with risk assessments, you'll understand that this can go down to even the smallest level of, do you have keypads on your door entrances? Do you have air conditioning in your server rooms? Obviously, that's not always going to fall down to the IT team. That could be down to a facilities manager or alike. So we will come off of the slides now and we'll move into the system itself. So I'm just going to temporarily pause my screen whilst we switch over. And I'll just make sure that everything comes through. If you want to ask questions at this point, I'm just going to mark it at 21 minutes past 11. If you do have any questions, now will be a good time to raise them so that we can get started on the next section and cover off any questions towards the end whilst I'm able to keep track of where we are. So in 2 moments, you will be able to see my screen coming through again, all being well. So I'm just going to select play, and we are now inside of Cyber Comply. So as I've mentioned previously, I understand that some people on the meeting this morning are probably familiar with the dashboard that we're currently looking at. If you are not, we will give you a quick introduction. The dashboard is an area that is immediately available to you as soon as you log on to the portal, but more importantly, it doesn't give you all of the full granularity. It simply gives you the highlights. Some may call it an executive dashboard. The name from that's only been coined simply from the basis that if you are a risk manager and you need to be presenting this to the board of directors to understand if you can have a resource or finance made available to you, using the dashboard here, it's just a very clean-cut way of saying, look, we've been through our assessment, we've done all of our questionnaires, we've done the scope, etc. We can see from this very top level that at the moment we're currently either having to avoid a lot of the risk because we don't have the controls in place. We're having to share a lot of them because, again, we don't have the framework or the resource available to us, or you might actually be in the better position of, through just general good work with regards to implementing a standard ISMS before implementing 27001, you might find that you're actually able to modify or treat a lot of the risks based on the sort of implementation of firewalls, antiviruses, keypads on doors, if they're just standard practice in the building that you're in, for example. From here, at the very top right-hand corner, you will be able to access additional areas such as requests and assistance from us here in the technical team. You'll be able to see your user details, your account summary to understand who has access, who doesn't have access, what level of access do they have, are they seen as a read-only, a contributor, or an organization admin. The last section down here before logout will be your settings menu. We will have a brief look at this because it will give you, as the a person who's going to be using the system, to make it a little bit more unique to your organization. We do make available to the user quite a lot of helpful information when it comes to lists of common threats, common vulnerabilities, etc. But again, we can't cover all bases. The spectrum is relatively broad, so there might be something that we may have missed. So what we've allowed the users to do here is add in their own classifications. Now, classifications are typically restricted to the asset type. So is the asset a public asset? Is it a restricted, private, confidential? We've added on some additional ones on here. So we've seen some local police forces using this. So sensitive or highly restrictive may be the case if you're looking at certain criminal documentation. Below there, we then have access to custom regions. Now, predominantly this may be used when you're looking at processes and locations of assets in line with the GDPR, but if you're doing one, you may do the other. What we'll be able to do here is specify exactly where something may be. A prime example is, without giving too much detail away, our organization is located within the same city. However, we have multiple buildings located around that same area. We're all in the same jurisdiction state, so we're all in the EEA, apart from we have an American office and we also have a Southern Ireland office as well. So obviously there may be different jurisdictions in place, different regulations that may apply, and ultimately the different risks as well. As we go through, we then have access to contact details, which is predominantly for DPO's information and your business details. So if you're looking to work on data protection impact assessments or data flow mapping, that's also available. We have custom personal data items relating to the data mapping tool, data subjects, again, relating to that system, data sources relating to both DPIAs and also the data mapping tool in general, GDPR manager. And then the last two along the bottom here is specifically related to the risk assessment element of the DPIA, as well as your assessment for 27001 NIST and the like. So we can add custom threats and custom vulnerabilities as well. So what we're going to move on to now is ultimately how you're going to build out some of the starting points that you may find useful to get you kick-started on the journey for your assessment. And the way we do that is by using this drop-down menu at the very top here. We have quick access points here, so we can jump back to the dashboard. We can view our asset library, and if we expand on here, we can see assets by individuality and also by asset classes, and I'll explain a little bit more on that in a short while. As we scroll down, we have access to contractual information. So if you do have contracts in place with third parties, if you have some documentation to support controls, etc. We then have all of your ISMS controls that we've seen in previous slides. We have legal, and the last section on here is then going to be your risk assessment itself. Now, the main area that we tend to see businesses start in is either going to be in the ISMS controls or the assets. The reason why we mention that is if you go through your ISMS controls first, if you're brand new to the scene, it might be that you're already implementing some of them and you may already have pieces of documentation to support that. So it can be a good way to understand, okay, this is what we're already implementing and this is what we need to start working on. If we look onto assets, what we will see here is a preloaded list. When I say preloaded, it's by myself. Yourself as a user will see this as a blank canvas. Now, a blank canvas can seem quite daunting. However, if you are coming from spreadsheets, for example, there is the ability to import them. We offer a template in which you can download and populate with your data and then import it directly into the system here. What we're going to be looking at today is an asset that we've created recently, being our company website. And the reason why we've created this one is more directly in line with the recent cyber attacks on British Airways that we mentioned earlier on. If we expand on here, what we will be able to see straight away is information such as what type of asset do we see this as. Now, I'm not going to teach everyone to suck eggs here. An asset can be something of value to the business. Essentially, that's what they are. It doesn't always need to be a tangible object. It doesn't need to be a laptop or a PC or a server, for example, or a building. An asset can be maybe an intellectual property of the business if you're a software development firm, or just general information that your business uses to make money from. We then have operator, so who actually own, or who is the main operator of it, business size, not individuals. We then have the owner, so here we have the web development team. In my personal opinion, I would always suggest using job titles as opposed to individuals, where you can. The reason being is if you do have a change in staff, you won't need to go back through and modify all of this information straight away. The next area down will then be the location of that asset. Then you're followed by classification, the category, so what does it fall within? Is it hardware, is it software, is it system or a service? And then lastly, a description of what the asset actually is. So here we have customer facing website for process and sales orders and support inquiries. Where the true value of cyber comply comes in is to then allow you to both navigate around the tool without having to come in and out of different screens, but also showing as the assessment evolves and grows over time how certain elements of cyber comply can start to tie in with one another. The key way that you can do this is by, if we're looking at an asset perspective, maybe this is how you're going to review the assessment periodically. You can select on the drop downs here and see very quickly, okay, today we're going to be addressing the company website. It's come around to its 3-month revision. Let's have a look at all the risks that might be associated with it. On mine, we only have the one, and it is going to be a denial of service attack due to inadequate failover capabilities. However, you might have other ones, maybe a clone of the same website, etc. Along the top here, you'll also have extras such as linking to contracts, tasks that you may be wishing to assign to both yourself and any other member that has access to the platform. We can also see if this asset relates to any other asset within the organization, and if there's any use of controls directly on the asset, not necessarily with the assessment itself. So once we've gone through the asset level itself on a very granular level, what we can then look at are asset classes. The reason why we've introduced this area is, whilst we have seen businesses do this and it's entirely up to them, but it is very time consuming, is by running the assessment on an individual basis. So doing laptop 1, laptop 2, laptop 3, it's absolutely fine for a smaller organization. If you're a larger, medium-sized to enterprise-size business, then obviously it's going to be an unmanageable amount of assessments you'll need to be conducting. So what we would suggest doing here is using an asset class to say mobile devices. They are inherently all going to have the same risks. If they're mobile, it means they can be taken outside of the building. A very common one that will link to that is something like theft or loss of the asset, maybe potentially espionage, in the fact that if you're on the tube or if you're on the bus or train, etc., somebody may be able to look through and see what's on your screen. So it might be implementation of privacy screens, it might be implementation of encryption should the device be reported lost or stolen. If we expand on the group itself, we'll have a description as to what's included. So here it's just anything that can be taken off site, and then below there we can show again if there's related controls to this area, if there's any tasks, if there's any notes. And notes is a key area for not only to leave messages to yourself and to your colleagues. You can upload documents here to support the group, and more importantly, and it's something that's going to be quite helpful when you're working with your auditor, is there will be a list of an audit trail to show exactly what modifications have been made, who made them, and when that change was made. The next column along, or the next tab along, sorry, is then going to show all of the related assets in this group. So we've got things like our CEO's laptop, our marketing CRM UK, and backup in the cloud. These are just examples, but just to give you a feel for it. And then next down here, we can then see all of the related risks to the group in the same way that we could see the assets as well. So we can see here that the compromise of information, theft of equipment, and also theft and loss of the asset as well are related risks to this particular group or asset class. Moving on from there, we're then going to have a look at controls, and because our favorite type of framework is 27001, this is the one we're predominantly going to be focusing on. Now, we have all of the controls broken down in here. If we just select on the top one here, so A 5.1.1, we can see that there's a green star next to this. What that essentially means is at some point, either through the assessment or by going through the controls one by one, is going to be marking that yes, this one has been marked as implemented in the organization. We have other options for selected and planned, and when that is chosen, you'll be forced to assign a task to obviously fulfill the risk treatment plan element of it. We can also say that, okay, based on our type of business, we don't actually implement that control, so we're going to mark it as not applicable or excluded, and as standard, out of the box, the system will come marking all of them as not considered at this time until you go through and manually work out where they belong. What you'll also be able to see at the top here is some extra work that our subject matter experts have done, both from Vigilant software and from our partner company, IT Governance. Here, we're able to see all related controls across the same framework and other frameworks. So we can see here that 5.1.2 is going to be a related control to 5.1.1. We spoke about earlier briefly how 27001 and the General Data Protection Regulation essentially cross over and knit into one another to essentially help with compliance or to help with implementation of controls. So what we've done here is compile a list of all the related regulations, both from the UK law, DPA 2018 and the GDPR, and how they link back to the framework. It can also be viewed vice versa. So if you're looking at, let's say, for example, Article 5.1 of the EU GDPR, you'll then see that a related control to that will be 5.1.1 from Annex A. As we go across, we can then show links to our contracts or documentation. We can see if there's been any tasks that have been assigned to this particular control, and this again will show up on your risk treatment plan. We can see related processes, so if you are looking to run the data mapping tool in conjunction with controls, they could be linked. We have that same notes section, so again we've got the ability to upload documents as well as notation, and there's that history log as well to see what modifications were made. We can see what assets are currently using this or implementing this control directly onto it. We can see if there's any asset classes that are using this control, if there's any records of data that may be using this control to maybe control that particular process, and then more importantly, we can now see all of the risks across the organization that are using this control. This is particularly helpful because we understand that different people work in different ways. By that I mean that once you've conducted the assessment or your initial assessment, you may revisit the same project by either looking at it from an asset perspective and going, okay, today we're looking at the company website, or today we're looking at advisor mobile devices, what are the related risks? Alternatively, if you're going through your documentation to make sure that's up to date and correct, you may choose to do it via your controls themselves. So we're looking at A5.1.1, okay, these are all the risks that are implementing it. Has there been any change to the policy or document? If so, and yes, then you might need to then revisit the risk to maybe change the before or after treatments with regards to the actual scoring of those as well. So from the control sets themselves, there's one other report that we can run from in here, and it's something that we mentioned in our slides at the very beginning, that being our statement of applicability. So previously, SOAs would have been run through the use of macros or formula within a spreadsheet. It might even involve a different spreadsheet entirely to make sure that it isn't being touched by the particular project owners or risk owners. And ultimately, they can sometimes come out to be a little bit too complex, both for the creator to explain to the auditor or for the auditor to understand how it ties in with documentation. What we've built here is something that we've again pulled on 15 years worth of experience from our partner IT governance, as well as our own feedback that we receive from our customers, and we've built a SOA which will include all of the core information you will need to have to make it simple, easy to understand, read, and provide to an auditor, or even for yourselves to do an internal audit as well. So at the top here, it very clearly outlines, okay, this is the control set that we're looking at today. This is the report type. We then have the ISMS name, so mine is just known as Vigilant Demo. We then have the date in which we have run this report, as well as a version number, which is ultimately what you're going to be certified against if you're successful in obtaining that. As we scroll through, if we go down to a control that I am using very often, is going to be 7.2.2, and what we can see here is going to be information on the requirement for that control, the reason as to why us as a business are going to be using it. So if you are using it as part of a mitigation step for controls, for risks, we can see here that it's automatically selected as a risk assessment. If we go back to the example I gave earlier, that maybe we're part of a larger group, for example, it might actually be due to business requirement. There may be certain contractual requirements that we have with third parties, or more often than not, it might actually be due to statutory or regulatory requirements if we're looking at the GDPR and other sort of regulations as well. Below there, you'll then have a field where you can enter in your justification. So why you're actually using this. Is this control relevant to what you're trying to do? So we've just put here, the justification is going to be that we actually have training rolled out to all of our new members of staff. that will be taken on mobile devices, for example, to help mitigate the potential of them leaving on trains, understand the importance of other people seeing the information on their screens, etc. And then lastly, we have the implementation summary. So what this is really trying to point out is how us as a business are going to be putting it into practice. So here we've just made it very clear, training will be rolled out on the first day of employment with the organisation, hosted via a web portal, and it references document 2.1.1. So if you do have another document you're going to be providing with this SOA, it will help the auditor and yourself navigate their way through that project very quickly and very simply. So moving on from our SOA, we're going to be now moving into the assessment itself. I do have a couple of examples on here. They're typically ones that we use for our general demonstrations and also one-on-one training if required. What we're going to be doing is essentially creating a brand new one from scratch. So what we have designed here is a system that can be used for the smaller businesses, as we've already mentioned. So you may just have the one assessment. However, you might also be a larger organization. So you might want to have, let's say, our sales division. Maybe you want to have engineering, things like that, just all the different departments. Maybe it's easy to split them up and have their own individual risk treatment plans to provide to the function owner, the product owner, etc. The way in which we create the assessment is selecting Create New at the top here. This will then give the user the ability to either add a new risk to an existing assessment or the ability to create a brand new one. So from here, it will take you through some standardized steps. So this is now touching on what we spoke about at the very beginning, so that collaborative, uniformed method in which you'll be conducting the assessment. So today we're just going to call this one October, just to keep it nice and simple. And then we have the abilities here to then work on the likelihood. So once you've gone through your scoping statement for the business, that'll essentially be where you're identifying the impact and likelihood scales. The terminology might be something you've also determined. So we could say here that actually we work all the way up to a 7x7 grid. And the wording on here is actually slightly differently. So this can all be modified. It's free text, so it's entirely up to the user what they wish to do. They might also have a reason to put in additional context. So whilst a scale of 1 to 7 with some wording on there does help businesses, but you might also prefer to see it in a percentage scale as well. So less than 10%, less than 20%, greater than 50%, etc. As we move through, it will then take you on to the impact on the organization. So in exactly the same way that the likelihood gives you the ability to modify, we can also do that here as well. So if we say actually it's going to go all the way up to 7 as well, we've given some wording and terminology, as you've seen underneath here, pre-populating. All of this can be customized by the user. If we edit on here, the wording here can be changed, and if we edit on each one of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability fields, they can also be changed as well to suit whatever your wording or fixture needs to be. At the bottom, you then have the option to add on additional context. Very common ones that you'll see will be maybe financial impact on the business. So like we were talking about earlier with British Airways, for example, yes, it had an impact on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data, but the financial impact on the business that came through the penalty from the GDPR was in its millions. So you will then need to take that into consideration, as well as reputation as well. Obviously, it was a globally seen news article, both here in the UK and obviously abroad as well. So it's going to have a massive hit on maybe future business as well, and obviously the trust that they'll then need to gain back from their existing customers and new customers alike. As we scroll down, we will then come into our criteria grid. This can all be modified. We just set it as standard as a traffic light system, ranging from broadly acceptable down to intolerable. We have seen organizations need to add multiples of these. So if we add on a new context here, we'll say it's going to be in black, and we're going to call this one critical. And once we've identified that, we can then hit save. If we edit the value now, we can then say that anything in this area up here, we're going to classify as critical, and obviously you'll then need to adjust either control implementation, or your response may even be to simply avoid the risk once you've identified it. Once we're happy with all of this, we've added on a small section that is not part of a general 27001 risk assessment, but it might be something you might want to run in conjunction with it to help with understanding risks when it comes to looking at the rights and freedoms of your data subjects as well, more in line with regulations as opposed to controls. Once we hit save on here, it will take us back to this home screen, and we can now see that our new group has been created. Select on the group, we are currently seeing that there are 0 risks associated with it. So what we are going to do is either use the 3 lines here to work on an asset-based risk assessment or scenario-based, depending on which one you prefer. Asset-based, as I've mentioned previously, is something that's a little bit more thorough. It is more time-consuming by its nature. However, it will give you a better feel and understanding as to the potential risks on an individual basis. Alternatively, you can do it on a scenario base. So it is a lot faster way of conducting the assessment. It's not as thorough, and it will predominantly need improvement over time, maybe once you've got certification. You can also delete the assessment group here. You will be asked to confirm a number of times because it will also remove any of the risks associated to the group. And then lastly, down here, you'll then have the ability to edit. So if you are let's say in a year or two's time going to say, well, actually, no, we want to really tighten our ship now, and we're going to do that by reducing what actually is seen as acceptable in the business to try and pull or control the risk a little bit tighter. Once we've done all this, what we're going to actually choose to do is do it at the very top here, and we should now be able to see that our October group has been created, and we can now select on here to take us through an asset-based assessment. So we're going to use one that I use very often purely because I know the controls we're going to be using and the types of threats and vulnerabilities, so it will help us navigate through a little bit quicker on the session today. So we're going to use our Advisor mobile devices. You will notice at the top here, you can switch to asset classes if you prefer to. So if we actually switch over and select mobile devices, it'll actually now switch over to here. There is quick search functionality, so we are fully aware that some asset registers can become very large and cumbersome. This will help negate that as well. Down here at the bottom right-hand corner is how we progress through, and what we'll come to first is then going to be choosing what our threat is going to be. So our threat is going to be the aforementioned theft or loss of an asset. So anything in this group is going to be identified as something that could be stolen when outside the building. And then we come down to the vulnerability. Here we have quick search functionality, so inadequate training. So if we scroll down a little bit further, we should be able to see inadequate security awareness, education and training, and this can either be for staff or supplies if you're working with contractors, for example. So we're going to say for our staff, and then we can proceed. What you will also notice at the bottom right hand corner is that save and close has now become available to you. We've been working with some companies recently where they've chosen that their way of working through the assessment is to have one person go round the business and identify the assets or the classes or scenarios, identifying what the threat and vulnerability might be. And then through the use of adding on their colleagues to the platform, they can assign a task to those users to then go through and then finish off the assessment by marking what the scores they believe it's going to be on the business, understanding what controls and response they're going to take, and then they can finalize the risk. So we're actually going to continue through today, and we're going to choose now the assess the initial risk to the organization. Now, if we were to select it was going to be an absolute critical, we could say that the general the likelihood is going to be almost certain. Maybe we're operating in a very high crime area, for example, or that when our staff do travel, they're traveling very far and wide. So there's a lot more interactions that might come into place with their luggage, for example, maybe multiple transfers on planes, for example. We're going to say that it's going to fall a little bit more into not very likely, but the impact is actually still going to remain quite high because of the type of information we might be storing on these. Maybe it's for blueprints for military bases, etc. You might want to measure it based on there. As we proceed through, we can then choose whether to or not measure on the initial impact on the rights and freedoms of data subjects. I can choose to ignore this because I've not toggled it on. We're now going to move on into choosing our responses. Now, anybody that is more au fait with 27001 implementation, we're looking at the response in the terminology of the 4 T's. It's typically what you might also be told in training. So here it will be treat, terminate, tolerate, or transfer. We've chosen to use slightly different wording on here to emphasize what they actually mean. To tolerate isn't just simply to accept the risk and just do nothing about it. We've chosen to say we're going to retain it. So deciding to retain the risk if it's unlikely to occur, deemed to be low impact, or modification is not cost effective. Modify is when we're looking to treat the risk, so actually using cost effective measures to bring that risk impact down on the business. To share is similar to transfer. The reason why we chose share over transferring is it almost sounds like you're transferring either the responsibility outside of your business to somebody else. A prime example of that might be that, let's say, for example, you are in a high flood area or a high risk area for that type of thing. The risk might be that you've identified this and your response is going to be that you're going to transfer that over to an insurance company to obviously get the ball back up and running, or you'll transfer over to a or maybe there's been a large virus threat to the business, so you'll be sharing the load with a third-party IT management company. We've chose to share it because whilst yes, it is easy to say you're going to move it across, you are still ultimately responsible to make sure that that is happening. The last one is going to be avoid. So this one's known as terminate. This is still helpful when you're going through the assessment on the fact that you do still need to identify that, yes, we understand that that risk was existing. We understood what the threat and vulnerability combination was, but because of now working through this assessment, we have no way of reducing the risk to it by use of control. We can't transfer that risk somewhere else. We can't simply retain it because it's too high for us to accept. We're simply going to have to avoid it. We cannot do that. That could even be right down to the level of we're going to be building a new server farm or data center. Fantastic. However, it's going to be somewhere that's renowned for having blackouts when it comes to energy, for example. You'll have to avoid the risk. You cannot build it there. You'll have to move it somewhere else. So we're going to choose to modify today. The reason for that is so that we can actually now start to look at the controls. Moving into the control selections, this will give you the ability to view all of the available controls to you, from 27001 through to NIST PCI. We are aware that some of our customers have asked to remove any controls that they don't need, and it is something we're working on, but for the time being we do still have quick search functionality. So if we do want to search by the annex reference, we can do so. So searching for 7.2.2 brings us to anything that has that in its title from 2005's 27001 PCI DSS, both 3.2 and 3.0. The one that we're going to be using is 27001 2013. Selecting on here, we can then see it's populated on the left-hand side. You might wish to put more controls into place to bring the risk down. We're just going to choose the one just for today's example. We're now going to be scoring based on what we believe the effectiveness of that control is going to have. So previously we actually said it was up here, so the impact was quite high, the likelihood was quite low though. What we have actually done though by putting the training into place, we're going to say that the likelihood is now very drastically reduced, but the impact is still going to be the same because we might need to identify a separate risk that should a theft or loss happen, that we need to bring the impact down by saying we're going to enable remote encryption, or that there's going to be VPNs put in place if they're browsing on open Wi-Fi access as well. So once we're happy with all of these decisions, we come on to the residual risk to the data subjects. This will not need to be completed because we didn't choose to score at the beginning. And then lastly, we come to finalizing the risk itself. So we're going to say that I will be the predominant owner of the risk itself. You might want to then also add on some other titles, maybe implementer of the control, just more for your reference. You can also add comments on here and supporting documentation for your decisions made throughout this process. And then finally at the bottom, you'll have a message or audit trail to show again, all of the changes that may have been made and who made those changes. So once we're happy, we can cancel out of here, and we will then hit save and close, and it will now take us back to the home screen of the assessment, where if we now select on the group we've worked on, we can see down here, if we expand, we can see the description, the threat and vulnerability combinations, the scores that we've given this, as well as the risk owners as well. What we can do from here is we can run a basic risk report. So this will just highlight all of the drop-down areas that we've seen previously. So if there's any asset classes related to it, as well as the assessment, or sorry, the risk itself, or more importantly, we can then run our risk treatment plan. Now this only has one in there for the time being, but if we scroll through, we can see that it's been dated. We can see the name and description of the group, threat and vulnerability combinations, the responses we're taking, who's the owner of that. We can also then see if there's any controls as well. If we look at another group that I've worked on previously on these demonstrations, so we can see here, if we remove ourselves out of here and remove the group, if we then go through and choose each one of these, we can pull these into view if we need to, in conjunction with other assessment sections. And if we run the risk treatment plan on here, we will then be able to see the controls used. And like we've mentioned earlier, we're looking at the controls themselves. If there's any tasks or anything assigned to them, we can see what those tasks are and the implementation status of the controls, as well as the deadlines. So the last areas that we can cover off are just some helpful tips that will help you navigate through CyberComply itself. The first one is if there are any updates available, be that control changes, be that graphical user interface changes, quality of life improvements, and also just general functionality. They will be available to all users immediately upon release. They will also be optional as well to begin with. Some will be forced onto the user, but others may be requiring permission from the user to pull them down. We also have search functionality when viewing an assessment. This is also available when we're looking at controls and regulations. We have pie charts here to give you a quick overview of the types of decisions that we're making. With mine, to keep the demonstrations a little bit more thorough, I've chosen to choose to modify or treat the majority of them. We then have help sections throughout the entire system. So using the bulb icon, it simply explains what you're looking at, and we can also do that over here as well. And then we also have select all if you want to pull them all into view to work through them on a one-by-one basis. So if we now return back to our dashboard, this will bring us here. One thing that I may not have shown on the very beginning is this is a customizable dashboard, so everything can be changed and put into place where you need it to be to either make it easier for presentations or for yourself to understand. There are also quick jump areas, so whilst yes, you can navigate using the drop down here, we can use the hyperlinks. We can also change the type of data that's shown. So if we want to say, okay, we just want to look at Vigilant Software's assessments, we can do that there. And if we want to do the same on our privacy risks as well. So that's brought us to the end of today's webinar and presentation. I hope that either the walkthrough of CyberComply has helped either existing users or potential new users understand how this system can help them track and identify what risks might be out there, and also speaking about some of the examples we were referring to earlier, that maybe this isn't the best time to take your foot off the gas. Like I said, cyber criminals do not sleep typically. Whilst yes, the cliche is that hooded guy sat in a back room somewhere at home, it's not as much as a cliche as you think. Damage can be done by an individual, not by a group of organizations, and it could be done from a laptop in an airport on an open Wi-Fi network. So if you can do anything you can to help negate those areas of concerns, either for yourself to sleep better at night, or more importantly, with regards to the organization you work for, the access of the data that you need, your reputation as a business, obviously with the challenging financial climate that Brexit is bringing, to try and reduce any sort of additional costs through potential penalties, fines, or general loss of data or function of the business. Using CyberComply will help you very quickly understand what those areas are that you need to be working on and illustrate either to an auditor or just simply best practice of frameworks, how you're going to reduce those. Anyway, that has brought me to the end of the speaking section. As I mentioned, we are now going to be moving into a question answer area. We'll allow 5 minutes just for the questions to come through. Like I mentioned, there was a stopgap at 20 past 11 where we got to the end of the slides before we moved into cyber comply. So if there's any questions prior to that, I'll go through those just now, and then we'll give a couple more moments to cover any questions, and then we'll come to the end of the webinar. After the session today, within the next 24 to 48 hours, you will all receive follow-up emails to this containing the slides from the show, also a recording of this presentation, whether you need it to produce a business case to maybe implement cyber comply, use it as referencing when regards to what did he say on that session that I need to really be thinking about, or just general training if you are already a user of cyber comply as well. So I thank you all for your time. I will pop myself on mute now so that there's no background noise coming from my location here, and also I'll unmute myself should there be any questions.